So hello everyone, and welcome to WTF. Oh wait, and that's not the one that ends with that famed word on the F part. In this case, it's Wild Tariff Frontier. And I have the pleasure today of having a guest for our Global Chamber Globinar on What's Up in Global Law that I believe was built to address that topic today. So I want to encourage everyone to relax, put your contact information in the chat, engage, be prepared to share and learn because we're here to enhance the community for the Global Chamber. Just some quick housekeeping items before we jump into the show. First, we're not giving legal advice, even though this is What's Up in Global Law, and we're sharing insights, experiences, best practices. Second, I mentioned that our guest, I think, is built for the topic. Let me give you a little teaser before we have Irene Chen, attorney, drop in. Office of Chief Counsel, Trade Enforcement and Compliance at the United States Department of Commerce in her prior life. Represented the United States in international trade litigation matters, including cases at the U.S. Court of International Trade, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and the World Trade Organization. A legal advisor to the Import Administrative Customs Liaison Unit on customs import rulings, and staff attorney in the Office of the General Counsel for the United States International Trade Commission, all before going into private practice and building quite a body of cases as well as representations and advice given. As is our tradition, we're joined by our co-producer, Jemima Escaltura, the Global Chamber. And with that said, let's jump right into it. You'll hear more from Irene in a few moments. And as you know, we start with our hot topic. Literally before we started today, we asked a number of large language models, what's the hottest topic in the world and in certain regions? Were you aware that there is apparently an outbreak of fatal mpox in Africa, and specifically starting in Kenya, according to these large language models? And at this moment, that's what they believe, based on their data, is the hottest topic. That may not seem directly related to global trade or business or law, but I think it is. And I think I'm going to ask Irene, because we were chatting before we started, to share her perspective on why that matters. So Irene, your thoughts?
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everybody, for having me today. Thank you for the Global Chamber, Jemima, the producer, and Chris. It is timely and it does matter. Every case that I've come across recently, and in fact, a case I'm working on right now, global events, what happens in a country has the potential to affect international trade, has the potential to affect prices. And in fact, we were just discussing how the 2022 invasion of Ukraine had an impact on a product that we are more or less litigating, I suppose, or handling as part of a trade remedy case before the US government. So all of these events have the potential and do impact trade because you're moving products across borders, you're deciding on prices, and prices have a big impact, not only to the buyer or seller, but also when the US government decides, all right, we're going to put a tariff on it, or if we're going to decide, for instance, is this product being unfairly traded or subsidized? So it all has an impact, and it's really important for every stakeholder, every participant to be up to date on these events, these world events.
Irene, thank you for that. And if I may just compliment and amplify it, these types of issues enhance or exacerbate complexity and make an even more difficult trade environment with the addition of these tariffs from the United States more challenging from just a human perspective as well as a business perspective. So building on that, I mentioned we asked these large language models, also known as artificial intelligence, and we have a category of 5 that we consult. A couple of prompts, and they're standard. We've been doing this is now our 8th show. We asked them, what are the top 10 developments in the world today, and which one is most important? Only once have we had all of the models agree, and that reflects some of the differences in programming and the human biases that are built into these. But the consensus from them today was that the famine in Gaza is the most important development now. And even that was not unanimous. It was 3 of the 5 models, Gemini, ChatGPT, and Perplexity, noted the famine. The other 2 large language models suggested either it was the situation in Ukraine or developments in artificial intelligence. The reason I wanted to mention those things is because they set the stage for how we consume information to determine how do we capture opportunities, avoid risk, and create value in the world. Let me ask Irene again, from her perspective, the famine in Gaza, how do you see that impacting what we're experiencing from a global trade perspective? You're on mute, by the way.
Undoubtedly has an impact because trade is political. The tariffs that are being negotiated right now with each country, that is political. Decisions being made in trade cases in the US has a political aspect to it. So even if there's not a direct, immediate impact, what's happening there and what's happening, the famine in Gaza and in the Middle East, that is going to impact everything regarding trade. We always factor in the political aspect when we're doing these cases too, because we know, especially in the administrative agencies, there are political appointees that are making decisions. In these negotiations regarding the reciprocal and the IEEPA tariffs, of course, it's the Trump administration spearheading and leading those negotiations. So that, and there appears to be sort of some non-trade factors that are being played out in those negotiations. So in that aspect, it's quite unpredictable. These everyday world events, these very serious events like the famine in Gaza, there will be an impact. Where that will be, we don't know yet.
All right, thank you for that. And let's just move us forward in the agenda. And let's hear a little bit more about your journey. But also, I just want to mention to the audience that it's not a gloom and doom despair situation. We'll share some data a little bit later. There are opportunities if you're wise and thoughtful, and there are also a lot of risk. But to set the stage for that, let's put Irene on a pedestal and ask her to take us through her journey, to what she's doing and why, and ask her to help highlight the opportunities, to help raise awareness of the risk, and to share any wisdoms that she has about her work. So, Irene, please take us off with tariffs, opportunities, risks, and sustainable processes.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. I wanted to kind of share with you sort of my background. My parents are immigrants from Taiwan. Actually, my father did trade, was an importer, actually, still is. And so it's interesting that I'm now in this field of international trade. So I grew up in Tennessee and I went to Columbia University for undergrad and Northwestern Law School and received my JD there. I started out in the federal government, first at the International Trade Commission, which is a smaller federal agency, about 300 to 400 folks, and they work on trade remedies, which are anti-dumping countervailing duty cases, as well as 337 patent cases. So occasionally you'll see them in the news because they may be working on some sort of, for example, Apple patents or something. There's something quite, impactful to the country at large. I mean, they, for trade cases, they decide the injury portion of anti-dumping countervailing duty cases, which are basically unfairly dumped goods in the US or subsidized by foreign governments. So I worked at the ITC first, then I moved on to the Department of Commerce, working in their section of the agency that dealt with their side of the unfairly traded, subsidized imported goods. So both agencies work together, and if they both make affirmative decisions to say, yes, these goods are being dumped, meaning they're being sold in the US at less than fair market value, or they've been subsidized by a foreign government and being sold in the US, then there is a what's called an anti-dumping or countervailing duty order, which means they have to pay a tariff. If someone's importing, for example, their orders on pencils, nails, all of the sort of those commodity products, they have to pay, the importer has to pay a duty at the border. So I've worked there a total about 8 or 9 years, and then came out and started my own private practice. And now I'm representing the other side. In the government, I was representing the United States. Now I'm representing foreign exporters, importers, producers, sort of, because they, to be honest, they need representation too. They're sort of in the trade laws, and really in trade policy, there is a focus towards protecting the US industry, protecting US manufacturing, protecting US jobs. But there's also a place, and a very big place, for imports. And while the laws are sort of directed to protect the domestic industry, the importers and the exporters, they have a say in it too, and the laws do apply to them, and they have rights as well. So we help them, and we do litigate now against the US government for certain cases. So right now we're in private practice. I am a founding partner at VCL Law. We are based in Tyson's Corner. Okay, so turning to the basics of tariffs, and I just want to say there's been some misinformation in the media about who's paying for the tariffs. The importers are paying for the tariffs. So a tariff is really a tax, and the country's government imposes that tax on goods from other countries. So when the goods are shipped in on the ship and they're coming in on container, they have to go through a process at Customs and Border Protection, and there's a bill generated, and the bill's generated and paid for by the importer in the United States. So, but why is this so important to know? Because it's a cost. So if you're bringing in goods at $100,000, and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, says, okay, well, you owe another $50,000 on top of the price of the goods and all the shipping and handling and all of that, that could be very significant. So, who's paying for that ultimately? It could be the consumers, importers, maybe the exporters in the foreign country take on some of that. But it definitely affects everybody. It even affects the domestic producers. Either they're being benefited because now their competition can't sell as cheaply, or maybe the market shrinks as a whole. So what are the issues here? Price and availability of goods. You might just get fewer in the country because less imports. In some cases, with these taxes, these tariffs, the US market is actually shut off to the foreign exporter, and so that we don't want to sell, we can't sell at a price that's competitive, so we're just not going to sell to the US market. And supply chain disruption, as we can see from retailers, restaurants, everybody that uses imported goods, or even works with a business that uses imported goods. It definitely has an impact. Next slide. So, and everyone probably has heard about the very recent tariffs, the IEEPA and reciprocal tariffs put on by the Trump administration, and the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify those tariffs. And the issue with this is that we've really, at least in my lifetime, we've never had such an aggressive trade policy where these tariffs are coming on more or less overnight. Usually, if there are tariffs that are going to be imposed, there's sort of a workup to it. There's either it's a case going on before the agencies that say these are unfairly traded, and that might go on for a year, and you have importers and exporters have some time to plan. Or there's trade negotiations, and so it's usually a slower process. But this, you could wake up the next day and you have 50% tariffs on the country that you're sourcing from, which is kind of dangerous. Yes.
Irene, quick question. Is there some kind of shortcut because there's so many changes going on? Is there a place we can go and like get what is actually effective now? The rest of it also almost feels like background noise. But is there some place I can go to do that?
Well, that's I think where AI could be very beneficial, because it's even hard for the trade compliance folks to keep up with it. It's hard for the trade attorneys to keep up with it, because when the US government announces a new set of tariffs, it's usually buried in a very long proclamation or an executive order. And it's not just that you have the percentage, it's 10% or 20%. You also have all these rules that go along with it. Like what constitutes a product from this country? If you're making a widget overseas and you've got a portion of it that's sourced in that country, the exporting country, but you've got other inputs from other countries, that good actually might be considered a product of another country. And so CBP is putting all of the responsibility on the importer and all of their associated parties to make sure they're doing it correctly. So it's not just that you paid it. Did you declare the amount properly? Did you declare the country of origin properly? Have you classified the good properly under HTS, Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States? That all matters, because there are different regular tariffs that apply, duties that apply to different products. So there's a lot of scrambling, I think, by importers, especially, to try to find a way around that, right? Because if a good is from this country X, but the tariff is very high, they would like to change the country of origin to country Y. But how do they get there? And how do they do that without running afoul of civil and, in some cases, criminal penalties? I mean, the minute you start importing to the US, that's actually a potential legal liability. So it really introduces a whole level of complexity. And then sometimes if you have overlapping duties owed on a good, for example, steel and aluminum tariffs, you might be exempt from the country's tariffs. So how do you know all that? How are you going to know all that? I think AI has a big role in getting that information to parties quickly.
I'm going to take you out for a beverage sometime to get a deeper dive into that. Try to keep us on schedule. I know you have so much useful information to share, so please continue.
Yes. And here you can see that the first chart rolled out by the government was this very intimidating chart of all of the countries in the world. And that was not the last word. Actually, that was sort of the first, I guess, the first shot or the first shot across the bow. Here's what we're going to do. Next slide, Chris. But it was a starting point for the negotiation by the administration. And I've heard from someone in a foreign countries in their consulate that they were having discussions with the trade officials of the US government, but even they could not tell they could not say this is what the number is going to be. It actually had to go to the very top. The presidents of those countries, the US president and the foreign countries president, had to meet and talk, and that number then came out. So you can see that this I've never heard of this kind of scenario, but that's where we're in today. So what are the risks of high tariffs? I mean, it's pretty obvious from this chart, US employment, because if you have more costs on the tariff side, you're just going to have less money overall. And the you can see with high exposure to tariffs, the employment numbers are going down. And that's maybe to do with some of the employment challenges that people are seeing right now. Other issues, you just can't get the inventory because you have to pay for it. I mean, when you contract for that, those goods overseas, you have to factor that in. If you can't get the goods, how are you going to do your business? I mean, you might have to go out of business. Or if you bring the goods in, you owe the Customs and Border Protection the money, they can come after you too. We've had some of those cases as well. So these are the risks, some of the risks. Next slide, Chris. So we've put a chart here of what are the affected industries. Low exposure, medium exposure, high exposure. Well, the highest exposure, I think, are in the industrial sector because they have high dollar inputs that they need, and it's not easily sourced in the US. It's not as though you can just throw up a factory or source from somebody here. You need all the molds, the tooling. It takes time to do that. And you may not have the expertise here. I mean, there are some foreign countries that have become very, very good at manufacturing. I mean, they're so expert because they've been doing it for decades. And that expertise, and also at that cost, may not be available in the US. Medium exposure, of course, your sort of consumer products, food products, things like that. Also, if you can't get that, cups, plates, forks, that we have it's not an IEPA tariff. We have a case in the dumping space that involves even the bowls that you see at Kava and Sweetgreen. So they're going after the importers of those sort of environmentally friendly forks and spoons and cups and bowls and things like that. So if your tariffs go up, maybe you can't buy as many of those, and you may have to maybe downgrade to styrofoam or plastics. Low exposure, maybe more of the services industries, but I would even argue, for example, motion picture and sound recording, there was talk of a tariff on that. I don't know how they would do that because everything is digitized. So it would be hard to put a tariff on something that is not tangible, but maybe they could figure that out. Next slide. So if some of you have been paying sort of close attention to the appeals winding its way through federal courts against these IEPA and reciprocal tariffs. So the first court that heard the case was the Court of International Trade, which held that those IEPA tariffs really were unconstitutional and exceeded the authority of the executive branch, that those tariffs were unlawful. Well, that's the first stop. So the next appeals court, of course, the US government appealed to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which just held their oral argument at the end of July. And they also expressed skepticism about this move or this trade policy by the current administration. They're expected to issue a decision soon. We fully expect it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Who knows what they will decide? This may not get resolved until the next term, maybe a year away. We don't know. If anyone remembers, during President Trump's first term, he put Section 301 duties on Chinese goods, on most Chinese exports to the US, 7.5% to 25%. Importers sued. In fact, a whole group of 3,500 importers sued the United States at the Court of International Trade in 2018, I want to say. That case is still pending now. It's still pending at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Meanwhile, the importers are still paying the duty. I don't think this case will be that slow, but I wouldn't hold my breath and say, yeah, we're going to get a decision very quickly. So yes.
Irene, if I may jump in,
Mhm.
as a business person, then what's the best way for me to keep track of these kind of things that are happening efficiently?
I would say the first thing to do is have a combination of your tech tools, the AI, and a trade advisor, customs broker and trade advisor, because you can't rely solely on AI because it sometimes it's garbage in, garbage out, right? You may not have the most accurate information, because when I've used AI, it is very useful. If I want quick information, if I need like a quick fact, I'll use it, but then I'll read it and then I'll see, okay, they describe something mostly correctly, but I know part of it is not correct. So you really need you need the resources, you need the human factor, and you need the AI the tech factor. So how do we deal with all of these uncertainties? Well, there's no one answer, right? But the key is you got to take action. You can't turn a blind eye to it, put your head in the sand, because it will not be good. Because we have seen even very small importers, they have imported and then they didn't realize that the good was subject to X, Y, and Z tariff, and now they're facing $1 million plus in duties. So really the first key is education. And that includes talking to your suppliers overseas and making sure all your paperwork is correct. We worked with a pharmaceutical company recently that was doing clinical trials in the US. So they were exporting certain goods from overseas. They didn't have any sort of compliance or customs language in any of their contracts. And so they brought the goods here. Then they got a big bill from CBP. They got a big bill that said, you owe this and you owe this and this. And they were shocked. And they went back to their supplier and said, hey, what's all this? We didn't know this. And they said, well, you signed the contract. I mean, that's the reality. When you start doing this, you got to go backwards, go back to your supplier and get on all fours and understand exactly what is happening, right? And what is your tariff risk? The other piece of that is potentially consulting with tariff advisor, trade advisor, at the very least having a good customs broker, and having that team together so that you can be more, offensive rather than defensive. The last piece of it is getting those tech tools, right? And next slide.
Irene, we have about 10 minutes in total left. Probably
Yeah.
about 5 minutes for your recitation. So
Thank you.
thank you.
So there are new types of AI tools being developed as we speak for supply chain. I think some of the larger retailers and they have a whole software setup where they can type in the good and it can give them, okay, this is how it's classified, X, Y, and Z. And those tools have the latest percentages, tariff rates in place because they're getting updated constantly. For a smaller company, that may not be viable, but it's at least worth looking into, because you have to look at it as an active management. If you are sourcing from overseas, that is, again, a potential liability. That's a potential tax to your business. And so you have to invest in these tools that help you, say, collect information more quickly, shorten the gap between events happening and the information getting to you. Because, sometimes if you have, well, I'll say if you talk to a lawyer, the lawyer's busy and they don't get back to you for 2 weeks, the time may have already passed, right? You need some other tools in your tool belt. So, and you also need to have tools that help you assess the risk supplier, because frankly speaking, there's a lot of sort of skullduggery going on right now, because the overseas suppliers, they want to sell you the good, but they're not as concerned about the consequences here in the US, because they're over there, they're not here. But you're here and you're subject to the laws of the United States and potentially civil and criminal penalties. So I think the AI, also there are AI tools that can help you assess supplier risk, even doing some due diligence or background checking on suppliers, even checking in some cases if there are sanctions involved against a foreign supplier company, checking that as well. Other AI tools that will help you sort of figure out your supply chain and where the risks are. Also, how you are able to get your goods here, if there are better ways to do it, cheaper ways. Maybe some countries, some countries are landlocked, some countries have ports. It's easier as far as shipping, maybe cheaper, maybe less hassle. That could help. And then also just helping you automate some tasks so that your time is not stretched too thin, because really this is really damage control in a way. It's not trying to win the war, because who can do that? It's out of everyone's control. You're really doing the damage control, minimizing the risk. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of AI. The next slide. So I went over those. So next slide. So what are opportunities going forward? Well, I think we're in an unprecedented time with this administration. I mean, taking the politics out of it, this is very unusual for trade policy and foreign policy in general. But that is the reality of it. You have to, if you're an importer or you're in the trade space, you have to take defensive action. You have to know your business partners well. That can be used with AI, but that could also be taking the trip overseas and meeting them in person. There's nothing like just going there and meeting someone in person instead of doing a Zoom call or a phone call, and touring their factory and really understanding what is happening here. Because, again, unfortunately, there are some of that sort of shifting behavior where they're trying to avoid or they're making representations to you, but that's not really the case when you go there. I mean, if you're a savvy business person, you'll see that. And then adopting technology. I know it's hard sometimes when people are old school. It's hard to make the shift, or sometimes you just don't have time. But if it helps your business and it reduces your risk, it's worth taking that time out of your day, carving that time out, and making sure that at least you know what's available. And lastly, also talking to trade advisors, finding the good customs brokers, the sharp ones that will help you with your journey and your company, and making those relationships, because it's a combination, human and AI. We have to have both. I think that's it for me. That's it for my presentation, but I thank you very much for your attention.
Irene, thank you for that share. Let me build on that as we bring it home to culminate this experience. First is, we agree with you from our research that it's the combination of the humans and the technology, especially with the humans and trusted advisors and trusted licensed people for the big things. And one of the benefits I'll say is the Global Chamber has a number of groups that focus on trade, technology, and other things accessible to the people, to our audience, that you can tap into. And if you go to the events, you can see some of those. But to build on the surgical opportunities that Irene mentioned, we did some complementary research. We looked at what are the global trade opportunities by sector in this trade environment, tariff environment. A couple of good news stories. And And by the way, the slides will be available if you want them later. In manufacturing, there are actually some hidden values, both in electronic manufacturing and in cars. And this analysis was done by a World Bank economist. So it's roughly about $70 billion of, I'm going to call it arbitrage opportunity, that if you're surgical and you're data-driven and you're diligent, it might be there to access. That's kind of the upside. But we turned the coin over too, and we said, what's the downside? What's the trade destruction, as the United Nations described it? There's about $450 billion of trade destruction, whether it's structural, based on China and tariffs, the European Union, et cetera. So that is something that goes back into what you're saying, that you need to be diligent about the risk, but also there are opportunities if you're hyper-focused. So we believe that human and technology is the best way to capture the opportunities and to minimize the risks. I want to go to our hot mic moment now, in that does anyone in the audience have a specific issue that they think is challenging they'd like to present and they'd like the team to address? Francis, if I may, please proceed.
Thanks. Great information, both Chris and Irene. One of the things I think it ties into the importance of understanding the contract, the documentation that is necessary, because you don't want to get caught with the CBP coming back to you and charging you with additional or tariffs that you weren't expecting. So I was thinking about the first sale rule. A lot of companies might be thinking about, working with their suppliers to, let's say it's originally a Chinese product, but they now are sourcing it out of Vietnam. But the two companies might be, the Vietnamese company might be a subsidiary of the Chinese company. And I understand that the first sale rule requires really separate entities, not legally tied to each other. So if you could speak to that first, that's my specific question. The second one is kind of the strategic planning of this, because it is now, but from what I've gathered, trade flows are changing, trading partners are changing, and how do we get at that? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Yes, there's been a lot of talk about these strategies to mitigate the effects of the tariffs, including the first sale rule. And there is a very specific set of criteria to qualify for the first sale rule. And I know there are many importers that are trying that because they want to reduce the ultimate declared value, right, legitimately to the United States. The issue with if that company doesn't qualify because there are affiliations, or one company is the parent company of the other, that is a problem. And I think there's a sort of a more overall suspicion over that, because and I think you touched on it in your second question, trade flows are changing. There are a lot of companies moving to Southeast Asia. They're now manufacturing Southeast Asia. Many of them are Chinese owned. And the US CBP is aware of that, and they're actually going after these factories in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Malaysia, and questioning, are you really making your goods here? Or are you making them in China and then shipping them over to the factory and claiming that they're a product of the other country? And so there is definitely risk there. I would say, unless for the first sale route, unless you have clear documentation that you meet all the criteria, I would not attempt it, because it's too much of a risk, because it's almost like a retrospective sort of look back period, because if you do all the paperwork, you've declared it X, Y, and Z, and you basically have attested to the US government this is correct. But they have the right to look over and say, well, no, actually, we don't agree with you, and we're going to rate advance you the original country. We're going to throw that out, and we're going to assess much higher duties on you. So part of the defensive aspect of it is to make sure that all of the criteria, the first sale rule or whatever else that an importer may use to mitigate the tariffs is met, and that you have documentation to show it. Sometimes the government is wrong, or they can be wrong, or they can be unreasonable. And then you have an avenue, the importer has an avenue to go sue the government and go to the Court of International Trade to say the government didn't follow these criteria and this was wrong. And they could do that, but you don't want to be on the sort of the back foot of that you don't meet all the criteria, you don't have the documentation, and then you're trying to justify it when they make the change. And so that would be my sort of overall viewpoint of that. I think every case is different, but you're right, trade flows are changing. I was in Cambodia in January, and I was quite surprised at what I saw. That there's a lot of foreign-owned or Chinese-owned factories out now in Cambodia.
Irene, thank you so much. And Francis, thank you for the question. So let's do a couple of quick announcements, and then we'll bring it home for closing remarks. And I think we can finish right on the mark. Next event. Next month, we're going to hyper-focus on blockchain and crypto, because as you've probably heard and seen, there are a lot of activities at the policy level as well as the business level for those topics. So look for that information coming out. That's one announcement. Second announcement. TIL, my startup, and a partner, Triversa, are applying to do an event at South by Southwest in 2026. So we're asking for folks to support our event between now and the 24th of August as a community event, and we'll send it, you'll see us on social media, but we just ask you to support it. And eventually, or should I say explicitly, the event promotes creatives and entrepreneurs being able to monetize their creativity and to get paid for it. Now, we're now in our final summary phase. So Irene, closing remarks for the audience.
Closing remarks. Well, I thank you all very much for your attention. It was really a pleasure to speak here today, and it's really kind of fun because some of my work involves, it's adversarial because we're in an adversarial case. So this is always a pleasure. But I would say, no matter what you do with your business, make those connections, get those trusted advisors, or just even people that you just chat with to just bounce ideas off of, because that's really where the you have all the information on the internet or even in AI, but you really got to complement that with some people that have the experience, that have some maybe some I don't want to say horror stories, but they've had some experiences that they've learned from. And that's where I find it so beneficial, just in talking with other attorneys and other professionals, and even all of you, just always learning new things, because that's really where I feel that that's kind of, in a way, some of the advantage, that you're investing your time in doing that and getting the information and being affirmative about how to deal with this situation and this environment that we're in now. So I'm happy to chat with any of you, just chit chat. It's not as a lawyer, but just to make those connections and then share ideas. But thank you.
Awesome. I want to thank everyone for engaging. We're right on our mark, and I think Irene dropped so much knowledge. We might get a sweeper to clean it up and then share it with you later, in addition to the slides, which will be available through Jemima and the Global Chamber. Everyone have a great weekend, and it's been a pleasure. Take care now. Goodbye.